Welcome to In This Body, a podcast where we dive deep into the potent power of embodiment. I'm your host, Ailey Jolie, a psychotherapist deeply passionate about living life fully from the wisdom within your very own body. The podcast In This Body is a love letter to embodiment, a podcast dedicated to asking important questions like, how does connecting to your body change your life? How does connecting to your body enhance your capacity to love more deeply and live more authentically? And how can collective embodiment alter the course of our shared world? Join me for consciously curated conversations with leading experts. Each episode is intended to support you in reconnecting to your very own body. This podcast will be available for free wherever you get your podcasts, making it easy for you to stay connected to In This Body, the podcast with me, Ailey Jolie. Welcome to another episode of In This Body. Today, I'm honored to introduce Hala Khouri, a somatic counselor, yoga teacher, and co-founder of Off the Mat into the World. Hala has spent over 25 years weaving together her expertise in somatics, yoga, and trauma healing to empower individuals and communities. Her work focuses on creating sustainable embodied practices for healing trauma and addressing systemic oppression. Hala's dedication to personal and collective transformation shines through her integrative approach, which blends body-centered psychotherapies with social justice activism. She works at the intersection of mindfulness, trauma recovery, and healing personal and social wounds, making her a pioneering voice in trauma-informed yoga and social change. I was fortunate enough to attend one of the Off the Mat into the World training sessions early in my journey as a therapist, but near the end of my time teaching yoga. This training profoundly shaped my understanding of the critical intersections between social justice, systemic oppression, and trauma. Like many yoga teachers, and also like many therapists, I hadn't initially received comprehensive training on how deeply these forces impact our bodies and the healing process. This training broadened my perspective, changed how I taught as a yoga teacher at that time, and influenced how I show up as a therapist. I'm thrilled to dive into a rich discussion today about embodiment, trauma, and how we can use our practices to not only heal ourselves, but contribute to a more just world. Hala, welcome to In This Body. You have been working in the field of trauma and somatics for over 2 decades. I would love to hear from you what led you to pursue this path and influenced the choice that you have made around what modality you support people with in their healing.
Absolutely. Well, I think that my path was revealed to me almost in retrospect. Ever since I was in 7th grade, I knew I wanted to be a therapist, and I was fascinated by psychology. And so I was devouring self-help books and taking whatever psychology classes they had at my high school, which was one. Became a peer counselor. And when I got to college, immediately I declared a psychology major, and I found myself really disappointed in the psychology classes. They were really boring. It didn't feel like they were teaching me about humans. When I look back, I can say, oh, they were disembodied. They weren't holistic. They pathologized people, right? I took abnormal psychology, experimental psychology. Like, it really wasn't what I was searching for. And ironically, I was learning a lot more about the human condition in my religion classes. Religion classes were talking about history and culture and how people deal with death and mortality and suffering. And so I inadvertently became a religion minor because, again, looking back, I'm realizing in those religion classes, it was what I was seeking. I was seeking to understand, how do we deal with trauma? How do we deal with suffering? How do we make meaning of all of this? Meanwhile, as my side job in college, I was a fitness instructor and a personal trainer. So little did I know that I was learning the mind-body connection before I'd even really heard that term. So I was doing one-on-one work with clients. We would be stretching and talking or on a squat machine. And, people tend to open up to me. So it would always be, we're sort of processing and exercising. And there was something happening in those sessions. I still remember one client, we were doing a hip stretch and she started crying and we were exploring what emotion came up. Mind you, I had not tried yoga yet. I had not learned about this stuff yet. It was just spontaneously happening. I remember another client was in a fight with her partner, and the squat machine was representing the conflict and the movements were representing how she wanted to show up. And so when I got exposed to yoga, there was this feeling of there's something happening in this space and in this practice that I've been seeking. I don't have the words for that. Now I can look back and say, oh, it was a practice of helping us get regulated in our bodies and in our nervous systems. And when I first tried yoga, I hated it. It was a very slow class, and I was too activated and dysregulated. It wasn't comfortable for me to slow down. And so I left it for a while, but I was like, ooh, whatever that is, I probably need it. So, I can look back and see that my path of wanting to understand what makes humans do what they do, how do we deal with suffering, how do I deal with my own suffering, led me to yoga as an embodied way of inhabiting our lives. And then somatic therapy as an effective way to support people in dealing with trauma. When I first got into therapy, ironically, I didn't know this, my therapist was a somatic experiencing practitioner. So again, all these sort of coincidences and serendipity kept guiding me towards this idea that we have to be addressing what's happening in the body, in the nervous system. If we really want to grow and heal, I'd spent years in regular talk therapy, could write novels about all my issues, but was still feeling really stuck. So those were all the things that really led me towards studying somatic experiencing and approaching healing in this embodied way.
Love that you brought up the element of studying religion and it being in your minor, because so often we have these conversations around embodiment. There is this missing link that so much of those sacred texts, you go into any really like faith-based practice, they talk about the relationship to the body. When you kind of sink in deeper, specifically in Eastern tradition, there is this awareness of the body in their practices, how they write about it, and a lot of it actually aligns with somatic practices today. So I love how, like, even right at the start, you had that weave. That's so interesting. I would love to hear about Off the Mat and Into the World, because that's how I got exposed to you and your work. And just to hear from you, if you could tell the listener, what is that training? How does it merge yoga with activism? And how did you find yourself being one of the people who started to birth this beautiful offering into the world?
Yeah, I love the story of Off the Mat. So Off the Mat was birthed in 2007, and we were started by the Engage Network, which was an activist organization that was figuring out how do we organize and mobilize people on the left. People on the right were super organized, right? They were all sort of aligned, whereas people on the left, and we still see this, we're all fighting with each other. It's very hard to find sort of a common way to be and a way to organize ourselves. And so they were looking at different spaces where people that might identify as progressive are. And one of those was people who practice yoga. So they actually were looking, they came to a lot of sort of very visible yoga teachers who were also doing some sort of activism. They went to Sean Korn, they went to Shiva Ray. I don't know who else they went to. And they said, we want to organize people around your work. You go out, you do these inspiring classes, you tell people to go get involved, but then you leave, right? Like you're not following up with people. We would like to capture those people and give them training and organize them. So both Sean and Shiva, who are here at LA, were teachers of mine at the time and colleagues of mine. And they both said, you got to talk to Hala. Hala's the one doing work on the ground, because I was teaching yoga to system impacted youth. I was supporting yoga teachers and doing deep shadow work. I wasn't sort of visible on the like yoga stages. And so they came to me and we talked about developing a curriculum that takes folks who have a yoga practice and want to find their purpose. And so Sean sent them to me. Sean, Suzanne Sterling, and I ended up developing the curriculum and then ended up going beyond what they were asking us to do. They were asking for a curriculum. And then we were like, here's the curriculum. And we'd love to teach some of it as an intensive. So we were doing organizing where we were getting leaders around the country to get that curriculum and teach it in their communities over several weeks. And then we were doing intensive versions of that journey. And the journey really was a journey of inside out transformation, right? So you are able to practice yoga, you're able to meditate, you have access to practices that help you heal and regulate. At the time, a lot of our audience were affluent folks, people who could afford to go into yoga studios, who then had time and money and wanted to, like, quote unquote, help.
Mhm.
Well, in their desire to help without really understanding their motivations and understanding the larger context of the world, a lot of them were causing harm or being like, saviors. So we were able to take folks on this journey of what's your motivation, and then what's your positionality in your social location? What is your responsibility in collective liberation? And, it was really beautiful. We were leading leadership trainings all year round. We had an incredible faculty. We trained hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of leaders who went back into their communities and were able to be more effective. A lot of them started nonprofits of their own. It was really a beautiful experience.
How does that work still inform what you offer today?
I still do a lot of work with leaders, although I'm working a lot more with schools and in mental health and in activist organizations. So for sure, getting to have the privilege of like supporting all of these folks over the off the mat was around for 15 years, right? So there was so much, I got to learn so much from our students and the leaders that emerged from the trainings, as well as our faculty. So a lot of my work right now is around supporting, whether it's a school leader, right, or a leader in a community, on how they are showing up effectively and how they are understanding that their body is their instrument. They need to be doing the embodied work to be regulated so that they can show up with the most impact, with the most compassion, um, and not burn out.
Yeah. Can you
Yeah.
speak more to the intersection between activism and embodiment? I heard it just in a few things you said, and that specific intersection I feel like is often so neglected in the conversations around somatics or any type of advocacy work. And so I would love to hear it from you because I know
Mhm.
it's an intersection that you know so well.
Yes, yes. And I'll speak to it from both directions, right? So you have folks who are deeply into embodiment, right? I had a meeting the other day with folks that want to develop an embodiment training around movement and dance. And, they were talking about all the things we want to consider when we're teaching, right? And this was a group of all able-bodied white women, right? So they had a particular perspective. And so as we were talking, I was reminding them, well, what happens if there's people of color in your class? What happens if there's disabled folks in your class, neurodivergent folks? How are we actually thinking about other bodies that
Mhm.
might not be our own experience, as well as other bodies that are impacted by the world differently than ours? So that we're not replicating in our movement spaces what dominant culture does to, queer folks, Black folks, Indigenous folks, disabled folks, right, neurodivergent folks, et cetera, et cetera. So that becomes really important for people, for certain people that are doing embodied work who may not have a critical lens, who may not be looking at context, power, oppression. That is important to bring to them so that their spaces don't harm or replicate systems of harm, right? And then on the other end, you have the activists who all they're doing is working with people who are directly harmed by trauma, who are dealing with urgency, who are dealing with injustice. And sometimes those folks feel like there's no time for me to rest or to get into my body. And they're in a constant fight, flight, urgency state, right? For good reason. And what can often happen is inside of our movements, inside of our activist organizations, we replicate the toxic norms we're trying to change. You see people gossiping and backstabbing each other, othering, replicating who's disposable, who's valuable. So for the folks who are especially on the front lines and working inside of communities, that work of really understanding, how do I regulate myself? What am I doing to care for my nervous system so that I am not inadvertently perpetuating toxicity or urgency or trauma inside of these systems that are so harmful?
I'm imagining, if I need to imagine, because I feel like it's quite solid, this is
Mm.
how somatics becomes a transformation of an individual to a collective process of healing, which I would love to hear you speak to specifically how actually going inwards and doing that inner work does lead to a collective healing or healing on a larger scale.
Yeah, it can really lead to that, right? Like I saw people do the inner work and just get stuck there. Like I'm just going to keep focusing on myself. And especially for people who have relative comfort, the
Mhm.
world is never going to come crashing at your door. So you can sort of get stuck in your personal practice, right? Um, and then that's also not fulfilling and healing. I think those folks are also suffering, right? And so I think that when we're really doing the inner work with this critical lens, and by critical, I mean becoming aware of sociopolitical context we're in, right? It 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 leads us to this reality that our liberation is bound, right? We saw this with COVID, right? With COVID, it was our most vulnerable folks. Until they could be well, literally the disease would keep spreading, right? Even if you could afford the best healthcare and to hide away in your own home, right? Like you were going to be impacted, right? And so COVID really showed us the way that our well-being is bound, literally. And so when we do this work, I know there were phases when I was younger, when I was like working on my own health, for example. I had a cancer scare when I was young, and I learned about pesticides in our food and farming practices. And all of a sudden, like it mattered what was happening on farms to my health, right?
Yes.
There was this real sense of like how we're treating the earth impacts me, right? So we are interdependent being. And a really big part of being healthy emotionally is feeling like we belong and feeling safe in our relationships. It's not an isolated thing.
Why do you feel like that piece has gotten lost? And a lot of the conversation around somatics is just somatic awareness. And that
Yeah.
piece that you just named, the interconnectedness, the connection to the body of the earth in relationship to our body, that piece often gets missed. Do you have any suspicions or at least hypotheses as to why?
I do, I do. I think it's individualism, right? So this mentality that we need to be okay on our own. And this is a very Western mentality, right? So some of your listeners might come from cultures that are very tribal and community based, and those are beautiful too. And sometimes the cost is your individualism in those cultures, right? So there's this middle ground, but like hyper individualism that look, on one level wants us to feel like, okay, if I just do things right myself, I can be in control, right? I understand that, right? But also individualism is sort of toxic because it puts a lot of pressure on an individual to figure out how to be well. And a big part of being well is being inside of networks of support and being able to ask for support. And I think that that has impacted mental health, a lot of somatics. Although more and more, I think that like when you're really doing somatic work, we're learning about co-regulation, we're learning about developmental trauma, we're learning about the importance of community. Maybe back in the UK, it's a little different, right? I think that culturally, right, it's a little different. So in the UK, like y'all might be usually there's like they're a little behind and like
Yes, we are.
um, so yeah, I think it's just a reflection of dominant culture. Dominant culture seeps into everything we do unless we're actively pushing against it.
Because I know that you do support people as a therapist. How do you push someone, if you do ever push your clients, when you can see that the individualist nature of their healing is actually stopping them from moving forward in their own personal growth?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm working with somebody right now, and we've done so much work on her trauma and her nervous system. But then there was a point where I said, you can't go to the next level of healing if you're not in community. And
Mhm.
so we started to explore very titrated ways of like, go have coffee with somebody, like ask for a phone number at a fellow parent at your kid's school, like really in a way that feels comfortable and safe to the client, inviting them to reach out into community.
Mm,
Um, and really having them understand you don't have to do this alone.
mm.
That's a lot of pressure, right? Oftentimes people have trauma around community, trust, and all of that. And so, again, how are you collaborating with your client to help them slowly build that?
How do you slowly and with a lot of help or a lot of grace support people to start to connect to the systems that may
Mm.
be oppressing them with awareness and also kind of titrate that process of coming into awareness around, okay, this is why I'm feeling this way in my body. I can't actually change that, but where do I have a sense of agency? I would love to
Mm,
hear that process for you from you.
yeah. So you're asking me specifically for people who might be negatively impacted
Yeah.
by broader systems. Yeah. I mean, a lot of folks know that they are, right?
Hmm.
But a lot of folks have sort of internalized that the problem is them,
Yeah.
right? And so when I see that, it's tricky because sometimes maybe that person, maybe that's a person from a different culture, maybe it's a Black person or a person of color, or an Indigenous person. And I have to be cautious that, as even though I'm Middle Eastern, I do get white privilege. I have to look at, is it my job
Mhm.
to say, it's like, it's not my job to sort of tell them about their oppression, but it is my job to support them in staying curious around how much of this is you and how much of this might be not you. And so I think there is, and you alluded to it in your question, like a cautiousness um, to making sure it's not my own agenda to be like, that's not your problem. It's because you're oppressed, right? But rather
Mm.
creating spaces of inquiry. Um, and sometimes like offering contrast, right? Like I have some young people in my life that are impacted by these systems, and sometimes they'll look at me and be like, "You have a nice house and you went to college," and I'll say to them, "I better have. Like my parents could afford to send me to college. It's not because I did anything special, and I'm trying to support you to get into college because you didn't get what I got." And that's not fair, because you should have gotten that, because so I try to find ways of framing and also doing a little bit of revealing, because I do carry, I feel like, a lot of privilege in my life. And so just sharing, like, this was, sure, I worked hard in college, but whatever, that's not that special given what I had available to me, right?
Yeah, I love that you named the cautiousness in my question, because I was like, as I broached in there, I like felt it in my body. And what I wanted to dive in a little bit deeper, if you would like to, or know this area, is the realm of embodied oppression. Since we both went to Pacifica, and that is kind of a term that kind of came from Pacifica. Um, how you support clients with that piece, because embodied oppression can often be so invisible and often so unconscious.
Yeah, it's true. And it can be like in people's bones, right? I mean, I think that, like, oftentimes one of the most powerful ways for people to move that out of their nervous systems is to actually be in affinity spaces,
Mm,
to be around other bodies that are like theirs. So I know, for example, if I'm working with a Black person, African American person, there's a limit to what I can do because their nervous system just may not go to that. Now, again, I don't think I'm being read as white, so there's a little bit more settling, right? But I always have to be curious. How is their nervous system reading me? Because they may not fully settle, especially if they're reading me as like a American or European white person, right? So I also know the bounds of what I can do, right? I can go much deeper with somebody who's, say, Middle Eastern, right? Because there's going to be a nervous system resonance there. So a lot of times it's about inviting people to find affinity spaces where they can really feel what it's like to not be hypervigilant. I had a client who was neurodivergent. They were autistic. And so we did as much work as we could. And I think that I was somebody that and this is a non-binary person, that they trusted more than anybody on the planet, right? And I'm not neurodivergent. I'm not non-binary. And we really had to work on, like, again, going into community. And when they found spaces of people like them, they discovered a level of downshifting they'd never experienced.
mm.
I think that's a really big part of it, is those affinity spaces to tap into what it feels like to not be feeling like you're code switching or you're hypervigilant to being harmed, right? To really feel like you can take up space, to then see how that translates into the broader culture.
I love what you just said, the affinity that that allows your body and your bones to just kind of nourish into and have that deep sense of safety. As I know that you work with people who have experienced trauma, what are some of the biggest barriers you notice with people who have experienced trauma in regards to reconnecting with their very own body?
Mm. I think it's different for everybody, right? I think that firstly is, what are the survival strategies that we have designed to keep ourselves safe, right? Is it dissociation? Is it hypervigilance, right? Like those are all things that got folks through, right? It got you through. And then so then we're asking people to like let go of the thing that got them through. So sometimes it takes time to even like give people enough psychoeducation to want to do that thing,
Mhm.
right? Because they might not immediately get that positive feedback. Like getting back into the body, if the body is a site of trauma, if it's a place that we've tried to escape and needed to escape to survive, it's like not going to be pretty to get back in there, right? I think that like sometimes, like, especially maybe newer folks doing somatics, like we get so gung ho, we're like, we're gonna get you into your body, and it's like, put the brakes on, right? It's like, how about maybe we're gonna get you into like your fingertips? Like maybe we're gonna like push the floor with our feet for a moment, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes it has to be so titrated for folks because it's an entire repatterning of a way of being that has allowed us to orient to the world in a particular way. And for some survivors, it's their whole identity is constellated around their survivorship. So there's the piece of re-inhabiting our bodies, and then there's the piece of like figuring out who we are in this new way of inhabiting our bodies because it changes how we inhabit the world. So sometimes I liken it to like, you were missing a leg and then you got a prosthetic.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, I'm going to now move through the world differently. I have something available to me that wasn't available to me before, right? Um, or, you get like a chiropractic adjustment, your body is like different, right? But you're like used to working in a different way. And so there's like the shift and then the figuring out who we are inside of or on the other side of that shift.
In what ways have you seen people really change after that shift? I know as a clinician, there are some things that I have kind of seen commonly my clients drop or start to question or shift away from. And I would love to hear from you if you have noticed when people actually start to inhabit their body in a different way and take up space in the
Mhm.
world in a different way and
Yeah.
find and have access to different resources inside, if there are some things that you see people start to challenge or start to change commonly.
The first thing that I will often see is that things that used to be okay, that people used to tolerate, whether it's like the way people behave towards them or things at their job, start to become not okay. Like they're like, wait a
Mm.
second, like I can't accept that anymore, right? And I'll often explain that because now it's incongruent with who you've become. Like you are now this person. So if somebody is rude to you or abusive to you or pushes a boundary, you're not just dissociating it, letting it happen. So there's usually a phase like of like almost like not irritability, but like things bother you that maybe didn't. Or the opposite, like some people are coming out of constant hypervigilance and anxiety, and actually being settled is scary, right? That actually feeling good is intolerable, right? So there's that like people starting to feel that they're experiencing life differently and it's disorienting. And I'm always stoked when people are in that phase. I'm like, this is great, right? Like you're fixing your compass. Your compass was not calibrated right and you were always lost. And now it's calibrated, but like you can trust it. And where is it taking you? And then I think that it's like seeing people's relationships change, like their relationships to themselves, like that inner dialogue. And then again, relationships that just where they're not being met either go away or they transform, right? So sometimes it gives permission for other people to change and to transform. Um, I mean, and the thing I hear the most, I think, is like people just feeling like they can trust their impulses. They're trusting. I often say your body is like your GPS, it's your guidance system, and you can trust it. You can trust what it's telling you. And then you can have empathy when oh my God, I'm raging right now, but it's actually because I'm triggered. It's not actually literally because this person, I should punch this person, right? There is this fluency of the body that allows people to feel this sense of like, stability, like, okay, I can handle what's coming because I have this instrument that is reliable.
How do you know or feel that yoga increases someone's fluidity in the body?
Hmm. I think yoga can. I don't think yoga definitively does. I
Mm.
think that it's like how, and you know this, it's like how are we being invited in, right? Because yoga can reproduce like anything, right?
Mhm.
We can go to yoga and dissociate and do all the things or be perfectionistic or hurt ourselves, right? But what I think is so beautiful about yoga that is not often present in other movement modalities, and I'm talking specifically now about the asana part of yoga, right? Because I think when you take the whole package of yoga with the meditation and the philosophy, it's a whole system that can support people, right? But I think most people in the West are like just practicing the physical form of yoga, maybe some meditation. Um, and what I love about the physical form of yoga is it is a way of connecting the mind, the body, and the breath when it's taught that way, right? When you are really being invited to inhabit your body versus dissociate. So you can put your feet behind your head, right? And just look spiritual, but you're actually not in your body. But yoga is an incredible modality to support people to re-inhabit their bodies because of you can pace it slow, because the movements get into different parts of the body, because it's dynamic.
How is the cueing different for a class that actually is one that invites someone into the body versus a class that maybe just allows you to get your feet behind your head?
Totally. It's stuff like, like when I train yoga teachers, I say to them, give people cues that require them to get information from their body. So don't say, for example, get your knee over your ankle, right? You might instead say, bend your leg until you feel your quadricep muscles engaging, right? So that little cue, right, is different. We're not just trying to look a particular way, right? And then inviting people like, notice what you feel in your body. Where do you feel the stretch? What's the quality of the sensation? And then based on the quality of the sensation, that gives you information. Should I stay? Should I back off? Should I go deeper? So literally cueing people to reference their bodies is how it's done, right? Versus just giving cues of how a pose is supposed to look, because then it becomes a performance and it becomes pretty disembodied.
As someone who has definitely used yoga as a disembodiment practice before, do you have any ways as a teacher that you kind of notice when someone is using it in that way, or ways that you kind of challenge to get them back in their body when you can see they're kind of leaving?
Totally. And I did that too for 10 years. I did yoga and I don't think I was in my body. Um, yeah, I think that like we can see, for example, sometimes you can see it in people's eyes, like they're just not there. They're just
Mhm.
like off somewhere, right? Sometimes you can read it in their bodies, like if their bodies are lacking energy. Sometimes it's the opposite, people that are overworking, right? So a lot of it is also like in my own embodied resonance with a student, but also like I don't think it's the job of the teacher to catch each person who's being disembodied, but rather again to offer that psychoeducation, to say to a student like, notice if you're even feeling your body right now, not from a place of shame, right? But like explaining, sometimes those of us who tend to dissociate, we can do hard things because we just leave our body and we do the hard thing. But that's not going to transform your life. So how
Mm.
can you actually be feeling what's going on in your body, right? Or the other extreme are the people that are, overworking in the practice, right? Maybe they're getting hurt a lot. Then we can put questions into the space like notice if you always feel like you have to do the hard thing. Maybe for some of us, doing the hard thing means we never have to actually feel because we're always in overwhelm. So, bringing in these curiosities to our students so that again, it's not on us to make assumptions or judgments, but be inviting that inquiry as people are moving their bodies. And, some students, it takes years or decades, or maybe you're never going to get through to them, right? But it is our job to, I think, to like as compassionately as possible, invite people in that way.
Are there any other somatic practices that you recommend to clients or yoga students that invite them into their body that you often refer to?
Tons. I just started doing weight training, which I haven't done since my 20s. And I've learned that like in menopause, we lose muscle mass. And, I have found these really beautiful body positive, weight training classes. And it's so empowering to like be able to lift a heavy weight. And then like, I've noticed that like I'm inhabiting my life really differently because I feel
Mm.
capable, like as I've gotten into my 50s, I've noticed like I feel a little bit weaker. Like I've internalized what aging looks like based on my my parents who like did not age in a way that was healthy. And so I was noticing that conditioning in my body. And so weight training has been incredible for me. I I do the Peloton, I run, I do HIIT workouts. I now move my body in so many different ways. And I still do yoga like at least once or twice a week, but I try to bring that compassion and that awareness to everything that I do.
Mm.
So I don't do yoga asana as much. I sort of broke up with yoga a while ago. Now I'm like kind of getting back together with yoga. But because yoga became so rote for me, it like became hard for me to be embodied. Like after 30 years of doing like the same movements, I
Mhm.
needed, but it's to me, the yoga is a way of inhabiting a practice. So it's a dance practice, right? It's even a practice with weights, right?
Mhm.
We can be grounded, we can be connected to our breath, we can pause in between everything and check in with our bodies, right? Although yoga will always has like a special place for that.
How would you support someone? It doesn't have to be explicitly in regards to providing steps. Start to create some of that compassionate curiosity that you're naming in regards to movement, because so many people have such a hard time changing their story around movement or exercise or physicality. And the
Yes.
story is either, I have to do this, or I'm punishing myself, or this is just what we do.
Yeah. First I will say, look at what, if you're working with a teacher, what messaging, like there's so many more options now of things that are body positive. They're not talking about weight loss. They're not
Mhm.
shaming you, right? So really explicitly look for that. So you're getting support, and maybe find teachers that are your mirrors, right? Like mirror your body type. And again, now you can find bigger body teacher, right? Even folks who are disabled, visibly disabled, that is so important, the messaging we are getting. So if you can't give yourself that positive message, find a teacher who can. And it's again,
Mm.
it's now with the internet, we can find those teachers more and more. And I think, practicing compassion meditation. So the Buddhist compassion meditation, may I be well, may I be happy, may I be free. There's actually data around that it changes the brain. So
Mm.
saying those things to yourself in meditation, um, and then setting yourself up for success, like even if your goal is to move your body for 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, like super low hanging fruit, go on a walk and listen to music, put on one song and dance, right? Like, what are you doing to get in your body? And start with something that's really, really manageable and where you can be successful at it.
How do you, in your clinical practice, support people when they do have more negative stories about their body? Maybe they are like really riddled with body hatred or view the body as something that needs to be punished. Where is a foundation place that maybe you most commonly start? Not that everyone is the same, but are there some places that you kind of have to touch upon to start to change that relationship to the body just subtly as a therapist?
I mean, it's interesting because one of the first things I do is ask them about like their social media and what messages they're
Mm,
consuming all day.
yeah.
Because we can do all this work in the 1 hour of therapy, and then if they're consuming messages all day that tell them their body's broken, it's not. So I will literally go into people's Insta, not literally because it's usually on Zoom, but like, let's go into your Instagram. Who are you following? Unfollow all these. Can you follow the body positive activists, right? So for some people, that's an appropriate intervention because when you ask them, they're like, oh my God, that's all I see all day long, right?
Hmm.
So I always look at because a lot of that is social messaging from the culture.
Hmm.
And it can really change the messaging based on what you're around. I had this interesting experience this summer. We went to Jamaica for 10 days, and I was with a group of friends, and the two girlfriends I was with are very lean. They don't really have fat on their bodies. They're very like muscular. And I'm more pear-shaped, right? And I put on some weight with menopause or whatever. And the first few days, and we're all in bathing suits, and I was noticing body shame coming up. I was like sitting next to them, the completely flat stomachs, and I was feeling this shame around my body, which has been a minute, because I'm not, and yeah, it's just been a minute since I've had that feeling. And then as we were on this trip, we were on the beach with all these voluptuous, big bodied Jamaican women, like proudly. And by day 4, I was feeling really sorry for my skinny girlfriends. Like I felt a little embarrassed for them for how their bodies looked. And I noticed myself walking out in my bikini, loving my curves. just based on environment.
Mm,
So I really, ironically, I think a lot of the body image stuff, I mean, of course, people have body image stuff that's internalized from their traumas
yeah.
and it's reinforced in the culture, right?
Mhm.
And so what are we surrounding ourselves with? Because that's going to land in our bodies so deeply.
I love that you're mentioning this because as I'm writing my first book, it tackles this question of like, what is all
Mm.
the societal stuff that lives in our bodies that we
Yeah.
have to address so that we can actually connect to our bodies? And we've just spoken about body image. I would love to hear from you some of the other ones that you feel are very important, that we must or need to address to find that authentic connection to our very own body that come from the society around us.
Yeah. I mean, I think that like ableism, like we
Mhm.
always have to be able to be producing and doing and working and moving. I think that like finding ways to tolerate being still.
Yeah.
I think about the nap ministry, like, all these Black women basically being like rest as reclamation, rest as activism, right? All those things that we've internalized about our bodies and efficiency and work culture. I mean, gosh, there's so much as women or people socialized as women, like beauty standards,
Mhm.
aging, youth standards, right? Like there's so much we are told about how we're supposed to look and how we're supposed to feel. And again, I think some of the most powerful antidotes to that is being in community around different messaging and how we inhabit that with each other.
Mm. It's interesting that you're bringing this up. One thing that I notice so much whenever I'm back in London, so when I leave London, all of these thoughts of changing or altering my body, they just disappear. And as
Mm.
soon as I get back to London, the first like 3 days, it's just so strong being in a
Wow.
culture, specifically being in West London, where there's a
Mm.
lot of access to plastic surgery and plastic enhancement. It's so present. And I know those first like 3 days, I have to do like a lot of work with myself to ground
Mm.
down into like, this is my body. I want to age. I want my children to see my face as it is. Like, and I
Yeah.
really have to do that work. So it's really interesting to hear you speak of just how powerful that environment is, because I know for myself, it's been very challenging here in West
Mhm.
London.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And the aging one is a really, really big one, right? Yeah.
Mhm. I would love to hear from you before we start to kind of close for today. If you have any, um, I don't necessarily like the word tips, but I'm going to use it, tips or tricks for people
Yeah.
to start to create a connection to their body if they feel deeply disconnected.
Yeah. Um, I think setting aside time, I think first is figuring out what is something that does feel good in your body, right? For some people, stillness, like literally pausing, pushing their feet into the floor, maybe putting your hands on your body, maybe those slow moments of checking in, if that feels nurturing, maybe you start your day with that. Maybe you put an alarm on your phone, you try it in the middle of the day and at the end of the day, right? So you're building this muscle of connecting to your body. For other people, stillness can be too activating. And so maybe you're like sitting and you're swaying, right? So, finding like, I heard this expression once of like, what was it like movement hors d'oeuvres, like just like a little hors d'oeuvre, like a little snack, movement
Mhm.
snacks, right? So whether it's a stillness, a body tracking, or a movement where, I think that especially if it's not a habit, it needs to be sort of ritualized, right? Like, so, okay, every night before I brush my teeth, I pause, I put my hands on the counter and I take 2 deep breaths, right? So ritualizing, just checking in, noticing what
Mhm.
we're feeling, right? So that then it can go to the next level where it becomes more of a habit, I mean, and I think for some people, exercise can help because then the body is like more pleasant, like the feeling after exercise can feel good. But I think these little like movement snacks or check-in snacks, right? Can start to build this, like rewire our connection with our body.
I love that. Movement hors d'oeuvres.
Yeah.
Is there anything else before we close for today that you would like to share with the listener? Anything that you didn't get to touch on or something you didn't get to touch on with as much depth as you would have liked to? And there's no pressure. You don't have to have something.
Um, I think just like having a lot of compassion, I work with a lot
Mm,
of parents and, especially parents of young kids where, they are attuning to these little bodies all day long. And then they feel like, oh, and I have to be attuned to but I have to do all, And so just like really having compassion and be realistic. So, if you have a little kid, maybe you sit and you do Play-Doh with them and you let yourself feel the texture of the Play-Doh. Like, how can you bring this into your life in the most compassionate, gentle way so it doesn't feel like a punishment or something that like you have to do that you could fail at it? Like really be realistic about your life and find a way to do it inside of that to start.
Love that you mentioned finding a way to do it inside of your life instead of
Mhm.
adding on something more to do on that
Yeah.
to-do list, or like perpetuating that ableism kind of narrative I always need to be doing, and not allowing myself to being like really
Mhm.
removing embodiment from that list of doing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. It was so lovely to get to spend some time with you. It's just so clear that you know this area so well, and that it comes from an embodied place. All of your information will be available so people will be able to find you. Is there anything that you want people to know that you're offering in the near future?
I mean, I'm not doing a lot of stuff live right now, but I do have a membership portal with like lots of short somatic practices and meditations, as well as longer yoga practices. So that's a good way if you want to experience the work is to go into the membership and you can, have access to all those practices.
Wonderful. We'll have a link for that. Thank you so much for your time. It was so lovely to spend time with you today.
Oh, it was such a great conversation. Thank you for having me.
If you found value in this episode, it would mean so much to me for you to share the podcast with friends, a loved one, or on your social platforms. If you have the time, please rate and review the podcast so that this podcast reaches a larger audience and can inspire more and more humans to connect to their bodies too. Thank you for being here and nurturing the relationship you have with your very own